Ladies and gentlemen, what a great pleasure it is to welcome you to this AGM. I wish that we were somewhere that we could be together. It's yet another one of these remote years, as it takes us on to what is probably the most pleasurable part of the AGM, which is to introduce to you our medal and award winners and to give them the opportunity to give us a very brief, maybe 10 minutes or so, presentation to the fellowship. So first of all, in relation to the Rivers Memorial Medal for 2021, this is a medal that is given to a person with connections to the UK who's made a significant recent contribution to fieldwork or theory, and is often given to a person who is near the beginning or in mid-career. Professor Fiona Jordan holds a personal chair in anthropology at the University of Bristol and has very quickly become one of the leading figures in the developing field of cultural evolution. Her fascinating work examines problems such as why do humans have so much variation in behaviour and culture, and why don't human societies vary more? Cross-disciplinary in her approach, she draws on biology, psychology, anthropology and linguistics, though her core subfield is cultural phylogenetics, understanding cultural diversity, using the same statistical tools that biologists use to investigate evolutionary and diversity processes in other species. Now, this forms a constant in her research as Professor Jordan is expanding her ideas in a number of different ways, through looking at the cultural evolution of kinship diversity, the role of social learning biases in the transmission of narratives, the cultural uses of plants in the Viking and Pacific worlds, and the study of cultural macroevolution through large databases. In order to implement these, she employs a great variety of methods, fieldwork and participant observation, elicitation experiments, transmission chains, interviews, linguistic corpuses, and many more. Her results are published in a variety of leading journals, the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, the Journal of Pragmatics, and the Journal of Language Evolution. Yet from one point of view, Professor Jordan's researches are entirely contemporary. From another, she is deeply aware of the historical roots of the investigations that she conducts. She is as familiar with the arguments of Tyler as she is with the latest thinkers. An outstanding and creative scholar, it is with great pleasure that on behalf of the Council of the RAI, I award her now with the RAI Rivers Medal. Professor Jordan.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much. That was absolutely humbling introduction to have, and I am still a little overawed at the honour, I must say, and in particular an honour to share with a handful of other awardees from Aotearoa New Zealand, people such as Raymond Firth and Te Rangihiro or Peter Buck. So if you'll bear with me while I share my screen, I shall tell you a little bit more about my research. Okay, wonderful, thank you. So growing up in New Zealand, as a child, I was lucky enough to go to a multicultural school with kids from all over the Pacific, and in a rather enlightened move for the early 1980s, at my primary school, we actually had our afternoons lessons partly in Māori, the indigenous language spoken in New Zealand, and so diversity in language and culture were really part of the everyday for me. And a fascination with cultural and linguistic diversity has really been at the heart of the work that I've done in my career so far. So not only was I delighted to receive the honour of the Rivers Medal, but even more so for work in two fields of anthropology, because I've never really been able to settle with just one. And as Ulf Hanna said in an editorial that's really stuck for me for the best part of a decade, for anthropologists, diversity is our business. It's central not only to anthropology, but to biology and linguistics as well, as Sue has mentioned. And so, although very often we're exploring tiny parts of a global pattern as anthropologists, it's the conceptual and methodological tools of evolutionary thinking that have underpinned much of my work in this area. And just to invoke Darwin a little bit more, my work really started with these curious parallels, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Darwin's observation that the formation of different languages and distinct species might undergo and share some similar evolutionary processes. And one thing our species is extraordinarily good at doing is learning socially. And it's this faithful social learning. Language is really a paradigm example of this process. That means that aspects of culture can be subject to evolutionary forces. There's variation, that variation is reliably transmitted, and there are some selective processes that act on cultural features or on their bearers. And the research I'll present falls broadly into a new tradition that considers social learning to be at the heart of culture, cultural evolution. And for the past 5 years, I've been very proud to be secretary of the founding executive of the Cultural Evolution Society, where we've been able to support an emergent interdisciplinary community going beyond anthropology into many other social sciences. And we've held 3 major international conferences so far. Just as the CES takes Krober's Tree of Culture as our motif, trees will feature in my description here. And I've been working with cultural phylogenetic or tree-based methods to model the evolutionary relationships of language for many years. And phylogenetic approaches bring together the traditional methods of historical linguistics with the sophisticated computational and statistical methods for modeling genetic similarities that have been used in evolutionary biology. For the past 20 years, since I was an undergraduate, I've been using and promoting the use of these methods for understanding not just the relationship of languages and their families, but using these trees as proxies of population history in order to understand cultural diversity. To give one recent example, in 2018, we published a brand new phylogeny of the very important but much understudied Dravidian languages of South Asia. This was collaborative work, and where much of the vocabulary data was collected firsthand in the field by Vishnu Kolipakan as part of her PhD. And here we used new methods that allowed us to incorporate known time points from written records, which were available for some of the Dravidian languages or population events. And we were able to provide a timescale with some error bars of around 4,500 years for the evolution of these languages. And this was important and was reported in the South Asian press, not only because the Dravidian language family sits at the crossroads of ancient population movements into and through South Asia, but it's a really socially salient aspect of identity for South Asian speakers of languages such as Malayalam or Telugu. But although reconstructing the language family relationships is fascinating, as I've said, the best thing for me is that they allow a whole way of, a new way of doing cross-cultural research, which has always been hampered by an inability to control for shared ancestry. We've called this Galton's problem in the past, and to understand change through time, and also by a lack of systematized and readily available data. And part of my work in the last 5 years has been in encouraging open data sharing for comparative work in the dPlace database and others. So given data about societies and the ethnographic present and their shared ancestry, we can use phylogenetic methods to simulate or rerun cultural evolution millions of times on computers to see different kinds of processes at work, to understand change over time, to reconstruct earlier forms of features, and to test for correlated change. So continuing the tree theme and building on some previous work in the cultural evolution of natural resource management, I've recently been working with ethnobotanists. And we've been using phylogenetic methods to understand the process of change in the cultural uses of plants. Our recent work brought together multiple lines of evidence, from medieval manuscripts to archaeobotanical evidence, to infer the plant toolkit of Viking Age peoples. And one lovely example is the use of meadowsweet, which is over now, but you would have seen all through the summer, used as ale flavouring. And this was supported by archaeobotanical evidence, linguistic reconstructions, but using phylogenetic methods, we were able to accompany this with a strong inference for its presence in the Viking Age, just using contemporary cultural data. So from phylogenetic trees and botanical trees, the major focus of my last few years has been family trees, in particular kinship terminology. In the Varrokin project, together with an amazing team of early career researchers, we've been using methods from cultural evolution and linguistic anthropology to take a fresh look at this very old concern of anthropology. Anthropologists have long documented and theorized the diversity of kinship terminology systems that we observe around the globe and considered their relationship, if there is indeed one, to other aspects of culture and society. So we classify our social worlds with language, but this varies, and it varies in ways that scholars have for many decades typologized and categorized into classic systems such as Hawaiian, for example, or Iroquois. But these systems show restricted variation, and this is what Sue mentioned. I'm interested in why things are different, but I'm also interested in why they're not completely different. So out of all of the billions of possibilities we might have for using language to label our relatives, we still only use a very small portion of this variation, and this diversity within limits remains underexplained despite the 150 years worth of attention by anthropologists. So in our project, we've taken 3 different approaches to try and add to the account of kinship diversity. So an account has to address not only the extent to which shared ancestry, so inheritance from a common ancestor, might structure how a language shares similar terminology with another, but the how, the when, and the why these things change over time. And at other levels of analysis in our project, we've been interested in questions such as how often do we actually talk about family members? How do we use kinship language? We've been taking corpus approaches here. And most interestingly, we've been doing work looking at how children acquire this knowledge. Is kinship easy to learn? Do people teach it? And does that differ across languages? Our first step in this project was natural history. So what conventions actually exist there in the world? Since 1871, Morgan's publication of Consanguinity and Affinity, anthropologists have done the work to collect kinship terminologies, but there are very few composite resources out there. So one of our intentions was to be able to collect and systematize as many kinship terminology systems as we could. At the moment, we have over 1,100 languages in our database, which we hope to release later this year as an open access resource for people to add to collect, and to utilize. And we've been working with colleagues in Australia and in Brazil on this, as well as a wide range of student assistants. And we've been supported generously by the British Academy and the Leverhulme Trust, as well as from the ERC. So we've used this data and traditional data sources such as the Ethnographic Atlas to have a crack at some of the long-standing questions in cross-cultural research. Things like whether kinship terminology systems are inherited with stability over generations, or whether they co-evolve together with norms of marriage or inheritance, for example. This is a selection of some of the papers that we've published so far from the project. And just to highlight some of the findings, we find that more frequently used kinship terms are slower to change, and this reflects a broader pattern in vocabulary use, but also applies to the specific domain of kinship vocabulary. And words for close relatives change much slower than those for distant relatives. This holds up over a range of Indo-European languages. We find that the classic system types are really reliably patterned by shared ancestry, so language family relationship is very important. And this is both on a global level when we consider hundreds and hundreds of different languages and various predictors such as marriage systems and geographic proximity, as well as when we drill down into the specifics of different language families such as Austronesian or Pama-Nyungan. However, when we tested these predictions about the correlations between kinship term systems and social norms such as descent or inheritance, marriage, residence, for example, very few out of 25 predictions drawn from the literature across a number of language families actually held up to modern phylogenetic tests, indicating that correlations we've observed in the past may actually simply come from shared ancestry rather than proposed functional associations. And our most recent work has used our GenBank database to show that the classic system types that we're all familiar with and that appear in the textbooks are definitively not internally coherent. So just because you know what a kinship system is in the Ego generation, if Iroquois, if it's Hawaiian, for example, that doesn't mean that you can predict what it might be in a parent generation, for example. So we have work ongoing to try and improve what kinds of systems that we might be able to characterize kinship diversity with. Winding up, so the work that we've been doing on kinship acquisition, so how children learn kinship terminology, is still ongoing. Kinship's cognitively difficult. So for English speakers to know that a grandmother is a mother's mother and a father's mother, and that's just in English, or that an auntie can be a parent's sibling or someone related through marriage or simply a parent's friend. Those are really challenging bits of mental algebra, and yet we expect children to be able to learn them quite early. We actually know very, very little about how children in different societies acquire kin terms of knowledge. So Alice Mitchell and I surveyed the anthropological, the linguistic, the psychological, anything we could find literature on kinship term acquisition. We've recently published this as a review and started to publish some of the findings from Alice's fieldwork with Datoga speakers in Tanzania. We've also made a field kit available for others to carry out similar projects, and we've been doing this in collaboration with Joe Blythe, who works with Mair and Pata speakers in Australia. So kinship knowledge acquisition is really vastly understudied, as I said, but we've proposed ways in which people in different disciplines can take up the mantle and start to understand this. But one thing we are finding is that explicit kinship knowledge, as elicited through naming or questions, for example, develops quite slowly. But young children, we have evidence from naturalistic observation, young children can use terms quite strategically to get what they want. Just to show you one finding that we're writing up at the moment, rather strikingly, there appears to be some kinds of universals of learning in that adults take the perspectives of children to help them learn kinship terms. So, for example, wait until dad gets home or where's auntie appears to be a consistent strategy for teaching this kind of difficult to acquire set of labels for people. So you'll see here the strategy about taking the child's perspective holds up across a range of languages. So just on my last slide, and separately from kinship, we've been using storytelling as a way to understand social learning and language identity. So we want to know whether it's who we learn from. Is it the storyteller, or is it the tale, the kinds of information that's important in our learning and recall of stories? So together with our colleagues, we've used the fact that linguistic accents are not neutral. Some are viewed as high prestige and some as low, and this is dependent on location. And we've had our participants in the US and the UK listen to invented creation stories containing different kinds of information from different storytellers, and then ask them to retell the tales to us. And we find that although accent prestige helps listeners remember information, it's really only in the absence of other kinds of compelling, sticky content, surprising information, or gossip, for example. So that's a bit of a whirlwind tour, and I think I've probably maxed out my time here. So thank you very, very much again for the honour. And I'm very glad to accept it on behalf of all of the amazing collaborators and co-researchers that I've had the privilege to work with over the last few years. Thank you.
Thank you, Fiona. That was just incredible, and I suspect doubly so, given that you're probably in a very inhospitable time of the night, wherever you are in the world.
I'm actually in Bristol.
Oh, that's fine. Then I don't feel quite so guilty, because I had visions that it was the middle of the night for you.
I wish I was in New Zealand, but sadly not at the moment.
Well, you clearly are a natural storyteller, because that was really a very, very clear and very interesting presentation. Thank you for that. I wonder if I could just ask you briefly, what is the biggest hurdle that you face in the kind of research that you do with kinship evolution? You could shift it. What's that biggest hurdle?
We've tried to shift the first one, which is the collection and collation of data. But I think the challenge is knowing that we still have unanswered questions from the past, but we have really exciting new ways to think about kinship as well, which I feel like sometimes I'm struggling to catch up to anthropologists of kinship in a contemporary sense, while we still haven't really bottomed out what we know about how people structure families from our questions from 150 years ago. So bringing those two things together feels like a real challenge for anthropology, at least.
Yeah.
Amanda, I just wanted to share, I've got a question from the chat from Ben Knighton. So he asks, if there are no universals and changes in kinship terminology and evolution is culturally specific, can there be any general evolution of the understanding of kinship parallel to the evolution of species?
So the lack of universals that we were finding were, we were not finding much support at all for hypotheses to do with social norms co-evolving with kinship systems. What we have found in the Passport and Jordan paper is there are some commonalities across language families in terms of how the kinship systems change themselves internally as a linguistic system. So, sorry, I should have been clearer on that. So that's what the no universals refers to, is those universals of social and linguistic change together.
Thank you. And if we've got no further questions, I am really sorry, but we're going to have to move on.
No problem. I'm looking forward to other people.
Congratulations.
Thank you very, very much.
It's such a pleasure to see you this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
I wonder if I could next ask Professor Rod Bugg, who is the representative of the Marsh Trust, if he would like to give us a few words. Yes. There we are. We can see and hear you. I can
see you, so I can only assume you can see me. Great. Well, how lovely to be here again. Next time, I'm sure it will be next time, we'll be actually able to see each other in reality. So how great to be with you again. I'm just going to say a few words, if that's okay, Sue. So there'll be the same words that you hear me say far too often, but let's do it anyway. So first of all, so pleased to be with you again. If I can just say something about the Marsh Charitable Trust. The Marsh Charitable Trust was founded in '81 as a grant-making body by Brian Marsh, and over the past 30 years, the Trust has developed an award scheme to provide recognition to those who work to improve the world we live in. Recipients of Marsh Awards are always people who make a difference by selflessly contributing their efforts to causes that they believe in. The awards, run in partnership with the Royal Anthropological Institute, form part of a larger scheme of 80 awards that the Trust runs in partnership with external organisations, spanning across areas of heritage, social welfare, the arts and conservation. The Marsh Award for Anthropology in the World has been presented since 2014 and recognises a person based outside of academia who has applied anthropology to the better understanding of the world's problems. The Lucy Mair Medal and the Marsh Prize has been presented since 2016, and this award honours excellence in the application of anthropology to the relief of poverty and distress and to the active recognition of human dignity. This year's awardees are, as ever, quite outstanding, and having read the two citations, I'm very much looking forward to hearing a little more. So thank you again to the Institute for their work you do, and to congratulate these two fantastic award winners. So back to you, Sue, and I'm looking forward to hearing a little more.
Thank you, Rod. You're so very kind, and it is lovely to see you again, and we really do so very much appreciate the support of the Marsh Trust. So thank you.
Well, I will get that message back to Brian next time I see him too.
Thank you so much indeed. The Lucy Mair Medal and the Marsh Prize for 2021 is awarded to Professor Larry Zimmerman. The Lucy Mair Medal is given to an anthropologist who has been conspicuous on the applied side of the subject, above all to someone who has devoted themselves to the pursuit of human dignity and the alleviation of human suffering. Professor Zimmerman has done just this, displaying a career-long preoccupation with developing ethical frameworks concerning appropriate treatment of human remains. Larry Zimmerman is former Professor of Anthropology and Museum Studies and public scholar of Native American representation at Indiana University. He taught at the University of South Dakota between 1974 and 1996, where he pioneered an approach to the negotiated repatriation of Native American human remains in his work with both the Crow Creek Sioux and the Arikara peoples, long before the passing of the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act of 1990. At the behest of the World Archaeological Congress, Zimmerman organised the Inter-Congress on Archaeological Ethics and the Treatment of the Dead, which in 1989 resulted in the signing of the Vermilion Accord, a joint statement by archaeologists and Indigenous peoples, which has subsequently served as a basis for a code of ethics in relation to human remains observed by archaeologists worldwide. Zimmerman was subsequently asked to serve on the ethics committees of both the Society for the American Archaeology and the American Anthropological Association. Zimmerman has been a pioneer in the fields of Indigenous archaeology, community archaeology, and collaborative archaeology, as well as having written a series of canonical texts on the repatriation of Indigenous cultural property and the reburial of Indigenous human remains. All of these achievements indicate his commitment to the pursuit of human dignity in an applied anthropological setting, and it is with great pleasure now that I invite him to address us with a few words about his life's work. Professor Zimmerman.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And to the fellows of the Royal Anthropological Institute, please accept my very sincere thanks for choosing me to receive the Lucy Mair Medal and Marsh Award. I was surprised to be recognized, frankly, and truly grateful. Just a word before starting. One of the things that I will not be doing is showing slides, given the possible sensitivity of some images to many people. As one ages, the questions about the paths one has followed become more pressing. A bit like that statement that is often made about life flashing before your eyes just before you die. This award has fostered lots of self-reflection on my part. If most of us would be honest, the paths that we follow are probably more like random walks than anything we actually planned. I have been involved with repatriation for nearly 50 years. Some of the events along my random walk were minor, but some were powerful enough to make me change direction. 50 years have provided way too many stories I'd like to tell, such as working on the excavation that triggered events leading to the 1977 repatriation law in the state of Iowa, the first such law in the US, and made possible by the tenacity of one Inkpoktuwan Sioux woman, Maria Pearson. A fascinating story that you can actually see in a BBC Horizon episode entitled Bones of Contention, if you're interested. Another major event for me, and actually for archaeology in the US, was the 1978 discovery and excavation of 486 victims at the Crow Creek Site Massacre in modern-day South Dakota. The massacre has a radiocarbon date of 1325 CE, so it's well before European contact. The site is on the lands of the Crow Creek Sioux Reservation. When we were asked to help stabilize a badly eroded bank that was undercut by a looter, we sought guidance from the tribal council of the reservation. They didn't want us to excavate and disturb graves, but knew the site was endangered, so they would allow us to excavate and study the remains only if we promised to be respectful and to rebury the remains when the study was done. When the news that the remains would be returned and reburied hit the professional archaeology community in the US, all hell broke loose. But we kept our word. And in 1981, the remains were reburied near the spot they were found. There were times during the project when I felt my career in archaeology was over, and I still occasionally get criticized for the decision to repatriate and rebury the remains. Repatriation demands were growing in the US, and by 1990, some 37 states had repatriation laws. Many conferences between Native Americans and archaeologists took place before that. Some were acrimonious, while others were productive. I was involved in many of them, and they were real learning experiences. Some of them were disappointing, more to me about archaeologists' attitudes than anything else. But with the 1986 meeting in Southampton that became the World Archaeological Congress, and the 1989 WAC Intercongress in Vermilion, South Dakota on archaeological ethics and the treatment of the dead, archaeologists finally began to realize that the pressure for repatriation was rapidly increasing and was truly international. Native Americans and other citizens lobbied the US Congress to take action. Congress first enacted the National Museum of the American Indian Act in late 1989, which not only established a new museum, but also required the entire Smithsonian Institution to work toward repatriation. In 1990, just a year later, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA as it's often called, was made law. It required inventory and eventual repatriation of all human remains, grave goods, and sacred objects from all federal agencies and any non-federal agencies, such as museums, that received government funding or permits. As important as the repatriations brought by the law, what was as important for archaeology was that NAGPRA shifted power relationships by demanding that serious consultation with Native Americans about excavation begin, which set the stage for what is now called Indigenous archaeology. Indigenous archaeology has done more to open archaeology than most of us could possibly have imagined. The number of increased advanced degrees held by a lot of Indigenous people, especially Native Americans, has increased at least tenfold, more than 50 people now. If you were paying attention earlier, you may have noticed that in the US, many laws affect only federal and state governments and those institutions depending on them for funding. You may also have noticed that on the Crow Creek massacre discussion, I mentioned the looter. These two things come together in strange ways. The remaining pattern, therefore, for repatriation is that US property rights are heavily weighted toward individual ownership, and this includes archaeological remains found on private lands. Some states have moved toward protection, but individual collections, displays, and trade of artifacts and even human remains seem little affected. And sometimes it's horrifying. I'll end with a longish story about a case that I've been working on for the past 7 years from near Indianapolis, Indiana, where I live. Let me encourage you to Google FBI, Indian artifacts, and Indiana all in one line. You'll find the story many times, see several photos and several videos. Just this past July, in fact, the story is still going on in a strong way. There was a long read story published in the Washington Post magazine about wondering when we would stop invading native graves. In the spring of 2014, my cultural anthropologist colleague, Holly Cusack-McVeigh, came to me for help. She had made the acquaintance of a Federal Bureau of Investigation Special Agent, Tim Carpenter, of the FBI Indiana Division. Tim was also a member of the FBI Art Crime Team, an organization, a subgroup that I never knew existed. Holly had enlisted Tim to speak to her museum studies classes about cultural property issues, and so he was somewhat of a regular feature in many of our classrooms. He told Holly about a private collection that he had seen in a farmhouse about 30 kilometers south of Indianapolis. He was visiting the house on a report that one of the small exhibits in the basement of the house was about the owner, 91-year-old Donald Miller, and his work as part of the team that developed the trigger mechanism for the first atomic bomb test. The report was that a visitor had worried that there might be radioactive material in that exhibit. There wasn't, but what Carpenter saw shocked him. The whole basement, he said, was set up as a museum with one small room set aside to display human skeletal remains. One was a full skeleton, but there was another group of skulls which had been manipulated to make them more appealing, whatever that might mean. Tim was then escorted to another building on the property that had exhibit cases filled with pottery that Miller told him were found in graves from along the Missouri River in South Dakota and from Arizona and a few other states. Tim also happened to recognize what looked like Chinese bronzes and labels on other items in the museum, which indicated that Miller had collected widely. As a member of the atomic bomb team, Miller was allowed to fly on military aircraft into numerous countries, coming and going without having to go through customs. Tim asked Holly to come with him to see the materials. Holly verified some of what Tim had seen and asked me to take a look as well. Miller also told them that as a Cold Warrior, he built underground shelters and tunnels connecting several outbuildings, and that he had a lot of unprocessed material in them. He also commented that he had stopped maintaining the tunnels and some of the buildings when he got too old to get down there. Many of them were filled with water, standing water, and unopened bags and mold everywhere. With permission from his superiors, Carpenter went to the federal attorney in Indianapolis to organize a recovery raid. Holly arranged for me to be the lead archaeologist and asked a Cheyenne Native American colleague, Charmaine Champion Shaw, to deal with many Native American concerns and to start notifying tribes that there would be eventual return of lots of ancestors. On April 4th in 2014, the FBI conducted a raid on the property with the entire art crime team, which is more than 20 people, and a large support team setting up large tents for processing the materials to be seized and for packing them. About a dozen of our best museum studies students and some staff members from the Indianapolis Museum of Art worked to pack and document materials from a collection estimated to be more than 40,000 objects. Over the next 2 days, we recovered more than 7,000 artifacts from multiple countries, plus human skeletal remains of an unknown number of individuals, because Miller had disarticulated most of them. But a study eventually suggested a minimum number of individuals much larger than 500. Truthfully, the only way I can describe Miller is as an archaeological hoarder. Photo and paper evidence showed that Miller and his family had looted archaeological sites in South Dakota for decades. Photos of his once young children, stretched out beside some children's skeletons, were there just for scale. Another photo shows the family and some friends using a calvaria at the top of the skull to hold apples during their picnic right next to a dig. Miller had bought and sold artifacts too. We found catalogs with prices circled, and because of the market in human bones, we found that he'd taken some bones and coated them with substances to darken them, then baked them in an oven to make them look old in the hope that they would sell better. Large numbers of Native American ancestors have now been repatriated to a group of ancestral Puebloan descendants in the Southwest, and another group to the Arikara Nation now living in North Dakota. Smaller repatriations of ancestors and sacred objects have gone to other tribes as well. Nearly 300 bronzes and other artifacts were repatriated to the People's Republic of China. Several skeletons went back to Peru. A small child mummy will probably go to Chile. More than 100 stone tools were repatriated to Haiti. Several Upper Paleolithic tools stolen from the Paris Museum were returned. The list goes on and on and on and on, but so does repatriation, and it's taking a very long time. Because so many of the skeletons were disarticulated, unless they were from known sites or were buried with culture-specific artifacts, they remain culturally unidentifiable under NAGPRA. But agreements are underway for unidentifiable remains from the Great Plains to be reburied near the Wounded Knee Massacre site on the Pine Ridge Lakota Reservation in western South Dakota. And those from other places will be reburied on the Pokagon Potawatomi Reservation near Lake Michigan. Given all else that happened during the recovery, one experience still haunts me. We found a machine shed, one of the outbuildings, whose door had been left open for decades, apparently. It was off the rails. Boxes filled the shelves that were in the machine shed. And as we pulled a few off, we noticed they were filled with mouse, rat, and bird droppings, along with nesting materials. In the bottom of the boxes, there were hundreds of bones of from infants and children. I almost cry every time I think about this. Sorted by elements, plus a few boxes that were unsorted with a few artifacts. About half the art crime team and I suited up in Tyvek coveralls with hoods and masks and set up an assembly line to remove the bones and bag them for evidence. It was a horrible task emotionally. And as I looked down the line, I saw hardened FBI agents with tears in their eyes. When we came across a blue plastic and metal baby diaper, it was a pin of a type used into the 1970s for cloth diapers. Anger was added to our tears, and I heard a few curse words I don't think I'd ever heard before. I thought when the public would hear about the case that it would anger people from across the state of Indiana, but I was wrong. Having been out front on a press conference about the discoveries, and with Holly featured in a long video on the national CBS morning show, we both got murder threats. We know where you live. You sold out to the FBI. Come the revolution, you'll be sorry. My point is that in this story is that it's not unique, at least in the US. Miller asked Holly once, why does anyone care? Then he told her, the Indians are gone, we conquered them. Tim and Holly pointed out to him that he had probably violated several US laws, including the Antiquities Act of 1906 and the Archaeological Resources Protection Act of 1979, because he dug and stole artifacts from federal lands. Along with human remains, there is certainly a large market for pottery and stone tools, which are often advertised on auction sites like eBay. Despite the effort of several archaeological organizations to stop such online trafficking in human remains and artifacts, it has had very little lasting effect. What does the future hold in all of this? As decolonization accelerates, international repatriation of human remains does as well. If you'll take a look sometime at part 1 of the relatively new Routledge Companion to Indigenous Repatriation, edited by Cressida Ford, Tim McEwen, and Honor Keeler, what's going on all over the world may surprise you in terms of repatriation. And I'm actually optimistic about repatriation now, much more so than I had been in past years. I'd like to say thank you again for this honor, but there have been many pioneers and even several heroes, true heroes, among Indigenous people and archaeologists, government employees, and even several politicians. Much of the credit for anything accomplished with repatriation should also go to others with whom I crossed paths on our random walk. Sometimes we pushed each other along, occasionally held hands to get something specific done, and a few times pulled each other back from making real mistakes, or sometimes even wiping away tears when things seem to go very wrong. I thank you so much for listening.
Professor Zimmerman, thank you so very much indeed for such a really sobering but compelling acceptance of the award. There is no doubt that you are a very, very worthy recipient of both the Lucy Mair and the Marsh Prize. I wonder, I can remember as a younger anthropologist, as I was at the time, reading so many papers that came out about the massacre site. In terms of our education to our youngsters that are coming through, have you seen a change in the real sort of educational level of our young people and their commitment to the recognition of what is important for Indigenous groups and this struggle that perhaps occurred in the past that we'd hope that we would overcome in the future?
Yes, indeed. And I think you're a forensic anthropologist, if I am correct in things. You probably follow this fairly closely, as you mentioned. In days gone by, one of the Indigenous people heroes that I would talk about is Jan Hamill, who I drove around with many places to talk to different groups of both Native Americans and archaeologists, and attended many meetings with her. One time she and I had a discussion, probably in the early 1980s, when we were pondering what might happen with repatriation and whether or not there would be a federal law in the US that would cover at least federally held remains. And we both agreed that it would not happen in our lifetimes, but it happened about 8 years after that conversation. We've seen it appear in textbooks now all over the place. The Crow Creek site massacre materials have been in many, many places, both popular and otherwise. The students that are coming out know about repatriation, and most of them understand that it is not just about identity politics, as it was once said that repatriation was concerned with. It's about real human concern, responsibilities for their ancestors, and even consideration for the rights of the dead that many of them feel are actually still alive, but just on a different plane. So I will say that in about another generation or two of students, there will be very few concerns with repatriation. There, as one colleague told me, when NAGPRA was passed, he said, well, the battle is now over, but there will be rearguard actions on it all. And there have been a few. Some of you may know about the ancient one, also called Kennewick Man sometimes. That was one that took us aback on what was happening with repatriation for a time, but actually worked out very much in favor of the kinds of oral traditions that the Native Americans in the Northwest of the US had about the ancient one. But also there's been one that recently occurred at the Society for American Archaeology meetings, in which a young bioarchaeologist, Elizabeth Weiss, gave a paper based on a book that she had written that deeply criticized repatriation. But the chat room on her talk was almost violently against the kinds of things that she was saying, which were touting academic freedom, the importance of science over individual religious groups and their contentions. So there will be things like that. They'll keep showing up. But overall, I think repatriation has won over most of the young students and many of their faculty members.
Thank you. And you've played such an incredibly important part in that, for which we are enormously grateful. Amanda, I think you have a question.
Yeah. I've just got a question that's come in on the chat from Keith Suter. And he asks, was the initial repatriation controversy a generational issue? That is, you were supported by younger academics against older academics?
I have to admit that I felt very much alone at that point in time when it first started up. It wasn't the case, actually. There were several people as archaeologists who were also working in their areas of North America, at least. Randy McGuire working in the Northeast, T.J. Ferguson working in the Southwest, and a number of other people who had done some work. Most of the repatriation impetus came in places in the US where there were large resident Indian populations. And so the students that I had, many Native Americans, in fact, they taught me a lot about the whole repatriation issue and the concerns of their people, their elders and others about it all. So those younger people certainly supported the kinds of things I was trying to do and my colleagues were trying to do. But there was resistance in places around the country and around the world. One of the things that really opened up everything for me was the first WAC meeting in Southampton, where a very generous man, one of your fellows, Bob Layton, ran 2 sessions that I was allowed to give papers in, asked to give papers in. And we were able to see the reaction of the people in the audiences. It was incredibly understanding about what we were trying to discuss, what we were trying to accomplish.
Thank you. Thank you, Larry, for your presentation today, and congratulations on being the Lucy Mair Medal and the Marsh Prize recipient for 2021. Thank you for joining us. It really has been an enormous pleasure and hugely enlightening.
You're very welcome.
Thank you. If I may move on to the recipient of the Marsh Award for 2021, which goes to John Lord. The Marsh Award is given to a person who is not themselves an academic, but who's made a significant contribution to public life using ideas drawn from anthropology. John Lord epitomizes the spirit of this award in that he has, throughout his long and indeed famous career, become the premier flint knapper in the country and one of the leading experts worldwide. Stone tool technology is unsurprisingly the backbone of Stone Age archaeology. John has spent his life making stone tools so that he may learn the process and then assist professional archaeologists to better understand the technologies they study, and of course for public understanding. John's home is a welcoming destination for people to come and spend a day learning about ancient technologies, and he takes his charm and expertise to schools where he inspires children in understanding both the craft and the past. In doing so, he has become an inspirational figure to the profession and to the general public. Not only this, because he has, through constant trial and error, rediscovered the techniques that must have been used in order to produce the prehistoric artifacts he's able now to create replica pieces for museums. At the same time, he has often illustrated that the way their artifacts have been analysed and presented in displays is often erroneous, because those who have labelled them are not as aware of their physical capabilities as he is. The same understanding of the way that stone can be worked, applied and used has led him to being a consultant to English heritage as well as other bodies, and to work on many contemporary building projects. Yet a different way to appreciate his work is this: John has extolled and lived embodiment as a way of understanding human activity, and emphasized the role of materiality as a way of understanding the constraints upon our actions, many decades before these ideas came to the forefront of our academic debates, and he's worked tirelessly to communicate them. A witness to his teaching writes as follows: I have sat with him here at the museum and within the classroom when he was teaching children and adults to knap flint, and it's a truly amazing experience for all those taking part. Observing the children, listening intensely to John's instructions, watching the absolute concentration and attention on their faces, and seeing their ultimate joy at having taken part is all down to the manner and characteristics of the man. There is no doubt he is a great teacher and has been and will continue to be a national treasure. So it's with great pleasure that I now present John with the Marsh Award and invite him to say a few words about his work to us. John, you're very welcome.
Wonderful to see you, and wonderful to be presented with this sort of an honour. And thanks. Initially, my appearance here is down to my grandson, who is my technical expert. Otherwise, I think it would have been a bit of total confusion. Yes, and the other thing is, I'm very dedicated to flint knapping itself, but I've chosen a career in vandalism. I'm successfully smashing the planet up, amongst other things. And so that does rather surprise me to be on it in any way whatsoever. But yeah, I started knapping flints when I first took up a position at Grimes Graves in 1975, working for then the Department of the Environment. And in my opinion, the site was not interpreted in a way that I thought it should be. And I started to knap just purely to show people what went on there, who were generally, the general public were totally confused to find themselves winding up in a field. So this is what happened. I started to learn how to make stone tools just for the benefit of visitors, but I got hooked, totally hooked on it. And I'd like to show you one or two pictures of some of the things that fascinated me. This one shows one of the most difficult things to make, which was made by our Neanderthal ancestors without any difficulty whatsoever. It's the Levallois point. Number 4 is the artifact. It was done in relatively few hits. Number 1, number 2, on a roughly prepared core. Number 1, number 2 would have resulted in a facet if the thing was refitted, running centrally down the center of this piece of flint. The next move was to remove a small triangular section from that facet, and then followed up by the removal of a larger one, which contained the impression of number 3. There you have it. an absolutely perfect spear point with no further retouch necessary. I still find that difficult to do. I had to go and have a practice once to see if I could do this for a demonstration at Southampton University. I didn't get much practicing because I found some Neanderthal remains at Linford, but that's beside the point. Knapping gives you great respect when you look at artifacts in museums and realise that some of them are 500,000 years old and even more. There's a skill involved that still makes me feel humble. Let's put it that way. I'll show you the next picture. I was working with a PhD student on chert. She had some wonderful, very fine arrowheads that were made from this material, and in my opinion, they had to be made on a designer flake, which you see on this slide, and then the flake removes from the flake. So you have two ventral surfaces on the material that you're working. It gives you a great advantage because every flake you remove from then on is your own work and you can set up the pattern as you want. But there was a difficulty. The work was so fine that in my opinion, it had been heat treated, which is another aspect of lithic technology, and possibly with the aid of a very early metal, the copper, when that was invented, could have been used as an item to flake either flint or obsidian or chert. It gave you very fine flake scars. It's very difficult to achieve these with anything other than a metal. Anyway, we'll move on to the next one. There is the result of the raw material being used without heat treatment. It didn't have the finesse that I saw in some of these arrowheads that I was presented with. I'm trying to make replicas. We did the heat treatment. We did use a copper flaker, and we were able to replicate pretty well what she was actually trying to achieve on this occasion. I'll have a look at the next one, and there you can see some of the flakes which have been put in the sand. It's rather like the North American Indians used to do this. We have evidence for that, to bury flakes, rough outs in the sand about 5 inches below the ground level, and then to light a domestic fire on top of the thing. Never, ever be in any rush to let the fire go on for days if you want to. About 5 inches down, the sand turns red. It comes up very slowly to a temperature. And when you finish with the fire, say there's no rush, there's no real deadline on when you should take them out. Let the fire cool off entirely. Don't be in a hurry, don't go in there too quick, because if you let them cool down suddenly, there will catastrophe will happen, usually with the sudden change in temperature. So let the sand get really cold, and then the material should look exactly the same as you did when you put it in, unless there's been any phosphorus material which caused an explosion, which sometimes happens. And then when you start to work on it the second time, there has been a chemical change to the material. It's much easier to work, and it has a lustrous appearance underneath what apparently didn't change through the heat treatment. And you see this lustrous appearance in some of the really fine artifacts that have been made with this method. It can be confused with sort of sand-blown results in natural environment. But I'm pretty certain now when I look at some artifacts, I know whether they've been heat treated or not. It was a pretty usual event for materials that were not too cooperative. Flint rarely needs that sort of treatment, unless it's a very bad quality one. And cherts can do improve with that. And there are one or two other silicious materials which are virtually unworkable unless you do the heat treatment, particularly American materials. Have another look at the next slide. There you see the reconstruction there of the designer flake, which has been removed, and the arrowhead refitted after it's been made. There's no heat treatment involved here whatsoever. This is just purely pressure flaking with an antler, and but it saves an awful lot of work if you make the flake specifically rather than to use debitage, which you may be sitting on a huge pile of. If you're a napper, you've usually buried your feet in it, and you can hunt around in there for pieces to make other smaller objects and that require a lot of refinement, but it's much quicker to make the flake specifically for the job rather than hunt around and have extra. It can double or treble the amount of time you have to spend on these particular artifacts. Have a look at the next one. This is an example of how Neanderthal in particular, it didn't make a tool, it didn't make this item, but what this slide rather points out is that some very fine stitching can be done without the aid of a needle. This is a section of skin taken from the hock of an ox, and cut out to shape and then pierced with a bone piercer. So the holes are quite wide to start with, and you can poke the thread through, and you can do a system where you can design your own stitching, however you like it. And it's quite quick. This wouldn't really be accelerated too much if you had a bone needle to thread it up to go through the holes that you'd already pierced. It's very, very difficult to get a bone needle through a skin because they're so shaped at the back. They're not very comfortable to hold. Don't make a hole in your hand at the same time as they're making a hole in the skin. And people have, particularly film producers, would like to think of Neanderthal were very untidily dressed because they didn't have a needle. And I refused to take part in one of these videos once because I said they were probably as smartly dressed as I am, because of this facility where they could actually push thread through holes that they'd made. It makes no difference to the stylization and the clothes that would fit on them and have to stay on them in the conditions that they were working in. So we'll move on to the next one, just to show the type of tool that was made much later. And bifacial tools quite often accepted in their own right, and hafting, as that wouldn't exist in archaeology, is considered to be a sort of maybe, maybe not. And just to prove that this whole facility can be done so easily with just a piece of wood with a split down the center and maybe hollowed out a little bit either side with stone tools and then whipped in there tightly with the aid of pig intestine, which has been cleaned and dried and twisted and turned into a very strong thread that can't be broken by hand. So you can, it's slightly elastic, so you can really whip round and round with this, and the timber holds the blade in like a vice, and then just to make the whole thing thoroughly substantial, it can be all soaked in resins of different sorts. I use pine resin and beeswax basically because it's quick and easy, and there's the result. I'll have a look at the next one. We jump about a bit. This was taken for an audio visual for Grimes Graves after I'd left there, in actual fact. They asked me to come back because they'd developed the exhibition to be give a little better interpretation of the site. So we made an axe for the video, that's it. We'll have a look at the next one. It gives you a close-up of it, I believe. Yeah. So That's before polishing. So there's about 20 minutes work. And then the polishing probably take another 200 hours. Interesting to know that at Grimes, they took latex casts of some of the axe marks in the walls, which was done with polished axes, which weren't made from the flint at Grimes graves at all. They were made from material from Great Langdale, which proves that they were getting around and understanding the material. So group 6 from Great Langdale polishes up in about 10 hours as opposed to about 210 hours in flint. So what is now observed by some archaeologists as a ritual object, like a polished axe, not ritual at all. They were made for hard work. And the reason that you polish the facets of the axe is to make it totally indestructible, with the exception of being misused and abused. So the polished axe marks in the chalk at Grimes graves had no scratches, no chips, and they were whacking away, cutting a gallery in chalk. There's nothing very ceremonial about that, in my opinion. You know, it's a tool, it's a method of consolidating it to make it a permanent fixture. We'll have a look at the next one. There's just a couple of examples of crude hafting of similar, an axe going through just a club, and that will do an incredible amount of it. It's unpolished, so it would chip initially and then become consolidated, and I've only ever seen one damaged, and that was damaged by a film producer who insisted on whacking ultra hard, and he split the haft open, but he didn't bust the axe head. That was quite amusing. I just struck the handle back together and I've still got it. The other one is the adze, which is an incredible tool. If you're in dense forest and you want to cut a spear stave or something, you can't swing an axe sideways. There's too much foliage and plant material about. So, but you can use an adze directly in front of you just to hack downwards, and you can cut out your spear stave or any piece of timber that it'll take you a few minutes, but it's not inhibited. Have a look at the next one. Just another view of the whole thing. There's the bone awl. I haven't really got a good sequence of all these tools, but that bone awl you can see is flat at the back, so you can put a lot of pressure on it. That's how it goes through the skin so easily. Whereas a needle, which you may have a picture of in a moment or two, has a sharp back. Try the next one, Ollie. Oh, possibly you could make a little case for a salutarian type blade, which is, I think the North American Indians have a very similar item to salutarian leaf point, and they put a timber backing to it, so it fitted in there like the back of a comb, and that could be reversed, or if the thing got blunt before it's resharpened, or you can keep the whole thing in a little pouch like this, possibly. No evidence for that, just one of my ideas. Have a look at the next one. Methods of hafting are no different on a smaller scale to they would be to hafting a big knife blade.
John, I'm afraid, just because.
Sorry?
Sorry, I think we had an interruption. I said, I wonder if it's possible for us to draw to a conclusion because we're running short of
Sure.
time.
Yeah, that's fine. And just once again, I'd like to thank you all very much for including me for this award. I'm very appreciative. I didn't know I was that popular. Thank you.
John, I could have listened to you all day. I can understand why your students just love to be with you. You're so enthusiastic about the subject and such a worthy recipient of our Marsh Award. I'm going to ask you just one small question if I can.
Yes, you can.
When you're working with a class and they're looking to you to teach them how to nap, can you tell instantly whether you've got somebody who will be easy to train, or are there just some people that no matter how long you had in the world, you know they would never be able to do it?
there's one thing I have noticed, because I've worked with primary children a lot in the past, is it's the girls who have an innate knowledge up to about the age of 7. They're not phased, they're not surprised at what you're doing. I've heard them explain to their people who the kids are sitting next to them, or their teachers or their parents, what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what you're going to do next, which is even more uncanny. The boys love to see stuff smashed. The more you smash, the better they cheer. But as to making anything, they, yeah, I think I've noticed this time and time again. I think women were the tool makers in the past, if you ask me. I do differ with some academics on that.
Well, I'm going to support you just on the basis of the fact that I think, you know, of many people, you know exactly what it takes to make these, because your experience and your expertise is just phenomenal. John, thank you so much for joining us today, and congratulations.
Thank you all.
Thank you. If I can move us on to the 2021 Public Anthropology Award, and this is to Professor Thomas Hylland Eriksen. The aim of the RAI Award in Public Anthropology is to celebrate an academic who has systematically contributed toward the better understanding of anthropology in public life. There could be no more fitting recipient of such an award than Professor Thomas Hylland Eriksen, who has throughout his career, even we can say from its very outset, devoted himself to maintaining anthropology in the public eye, not only in Norway, but also more broadly in Europe and further afield. Professor Eriksen's ethnographic researches have been conducted in Trinidad and Mauritius, Norway, and Australia, and currently in the Seychelles. His fields of research include identity, nationalism, globalization, and identity politics. Yet he's focused too on popularizing social anthropology and encouraging cultural relativism, becoming prominent in such debate in Norway, particularly in those revolving around nationalism. His two popular textbooks, Small Places, Large Issues, and Ethnicity and Nationalism, Anthropological Perspectives, have introduced literally thousands of students throughout the world to social anthropology, and have been followed too by other volumes such as What is Anthropology? A History of Anthropology, Tyranny of the Moment, Fast and Slow Time in the Information Age, Engaging Anthropology, The Case for a Public Presence, and many more. Publishing also extensively in Norwegian, he has been prominent in public debate in his own country in both the newspapers and other media. This, combined with his very many guest lectures and outstanding delivery, means that he has simultaneously introduced anthropology to a wide public and encouraged colleagues within the discipline to emulate his example and confidence of the worth of our subject. Truly, Professor Eriksen is an outstanding recipient of this award, and I would like to invite him now to join us. You'd be very, very welcome. Thank you.
So thanks very much indeed. So from flint knapping to Instagram, from container ships to kinship systems, how could one not fall in love with anthropology? Well, I guess the short answer is that sometimes people have to be nudged, and sometimes some of us have to contribute to that nudging. So thank you very much, Sue, for that introduction. And almost needless to say, it's with great humility that I gratefully receive this award from the Royal Anthropological Institute. And it means a lot to me, not least because I find myself in the European periphery, or a semi-periphery. I've spent my entire professional life at the University of Oslo. Started my studies here 40 years ago in sociology, which was at the time still considered a key to unlocking some of the doors, enabling us to understand the hidden processes underlying and structures underlying the contemporary world. Things were not what they seemed. And sociology, through its emphasis on class, inequality, and gender, offered those keys. By the time of the late 80s, early 90s, it seemed as if anthropology had taken over part of that road. giving us the tools to understand diversity, globalization, identity politics, the end of the Cold War, the implications of the end of apartheid, the wars in the Balkans. All of this happened around the same time in the early 1990s, producing in some ways the world in which we live now. And I found myself, as lots of Europeans, in the European semi-periphery. We somehow have the feeling that the action was elsewhere. So it's important for me to receive this sign of recognition from the Royal Anthropological Institute, coming from a small country. There are some rewards of being small, in addition to the problems of being small. For one thing, being a small place with a self-understanding of being in the periphery, you need to learn from others. So we have to learn languages, and we have to learn more than one in order to be part of the conversation, to communicate with the world. During the pandemic, many of us have learned that lots of the things that we used to take for granted, when we no longer have them, they present themselves as crucial. It's the metaphysics of absence. But for us in the periphery, we always knew that we couldn't take it for granted, that we were part of the global conversation. So we had to make an extra effort, which we did. Now, speaking from a vantage point of social and cultural anthropology, I'd like to use this opportunity to share a few thoughts about the situation for public anthropology and possibly some prospects. Now, anthropology has had a public presence since the foundation of the RAI in the early Victorian age, and it still does. We could have done better, but on the other hand, with nothing to be ashamed of. As I said, in the 1970s, it was sociology that seemed to offer the keys to open the doors, enabling us to look beneath the surface. And then anthropology, at least in some parts of the world, seemed to take over, offering other keys, enabling us to understand diversity and globalization and the problems of identity politics and the causes of identity politics. Today, our discipline has an impact on thought and practice in development, in multicultural issues, and the politics of identity, digitization, and more recently, that broad family of issues that can be summarized as Anthropocene effects, from pollution to climate. And although anthropologists may not be as visible as they could have been in public, in many countries, in many spheres, there is a strong influence in the outside world of anthropological thinking, often in indirect and almost invisible ways. In the past, in the book mentioned called Engaging Anthropology, I complained about the fact that we did not seem to produce the best-selling books explaining the world, explaining the complexities of the world to other people, notwithstanding brilliant social anthropological writers. I mean, in Britain, you could mention names such as Kate Fox and Gillian Tett, whose books are being read well beyond the professional community. It remains a fact that nobody from our ranks are capable of competing with the Steven Pinkers, the Yuval Hararis, and the Jared Diamonds when it comes to making compelling and widely read overviews of the human condition. However, some years on, I have come to conclude that this is not a bad thing. In fact, it's probably altogether a good thing. Because, as Fiona Jordan said earlier in this meeting, quoting Ulf Hannes, diversity is our business, which is a healthy thing at a time of severe threats, both to biological and to cultural diversity. So the kinds of generalizations we aim for are simply of a different kind to the kinds of generalizations that produce these best-selling books. Anthropologists are not the kind of social scientists who circle the world in a helicopter with a pair of binoculars. Rather, we would be the people crawling around on all fours with a magnifying glass, studying not the individual grains of sand, of course, but the relationship between the grains of sand, and producing some enduring insights from those observations. So the standard answer from social anthropologists faced with a popular simplification about the human condition or human history is, it is more complicated than that. You may be right, but it's more complicated. I mean, that kind of statement is hardly going to shake the world or make headlines, but it may still instill a few drops of doubt and complexity and wonder and curiosity into an otherwise sometimes lazy public sphere. As a matter of fact, perspectives from social and cultural anthropology are probably more widespread in our public spheres today than they were just a generation ago. Lots of people aren't aware of this, but our insights and our ways of seeing have seeped into the world almost unnoticed. People use our ideas even when they're not aware of doing so. And that is just how it should be. The public understanding of phenomena such as identity, development, cultural diversity, and I would add the smartphone and finance, would have been less nuanced and less sophisticated had it not been for the contributions from anthropology. And at least since the time when Evans Pritchard said in a radio lecture 70 years ago that Azandi witchcraft could shed light on the purges under Stalinism, the comparative perspectives from anthropology and unexpected juxtapositions have stimulated the social imagination and, I believe, has increased our collective intelligence to some extent. So today we are dealing with some rather daunting challenges for humanity and for the planet and for our common future. It's quite clear to me that both at the level of discourse and at the level of practice is going to require a lot of anthropological thinking or an anthropological way of seeing to deal with these challenges, what we could call the Anthropocene family of issues facing the world today. I mean, obviously, let me just mention a couple of things that anthropology can, or an anthropological way of looking, can contribute to the Anthropocene problems. One is, I mean, the obvious answer that anthropologists always give when asked, social and cultural anthropologists always give when asked what exactly it is that they're doing and what kind of knowledge they are producing. Because much of what we do cannot be measured, it cannot be quantified. And therefore it's countercultural and even subversive in this day and age with its obsession with measurement and numbers. So we look into the locally lived, the cosmologies, the perspectives of the local. And if you want to, if you want to create some kind of, or contribute to some kind of change in the world, it may not be a bad idea first to find out something about the world that you're trying to change. This has been the message from anthropology for 100 years, since the time of rivers, and possibly even earlier. And secondly, anthropology can tell us that our way of living is only one of many. There are many solutions to the challenges of living in this planet, some of them more sustainable than others. And it is possible that we may, in fact, in this part of the world, learn something from other people. As a matter of fact, that was one of the things that attracted me to anthropology in the first place. I've been reading sociology, philosophy, and then I ended up with anthropology. Because partly it was because, as Tim Ingold once said, it is philosophy with the people in place. But also because it is truly global, it really tries to take other life worlds seriously. And unlike other academic disciplines, we do not restrict ourselves to discussing with other intellectuals and academics. We develop theory in tandem with, in collaboration and dialogue with the people we are working with, whether they are indigenous people somewhere in the world or stockbrokers in the City of London. So it can tell us something about this. In other words, this means that anthropology, not only is it capable of stimulating the intellectual imagination and increasing our collective intelligence, which I think it does, but it's also capable of stimulating our political imagination, imagining how things could be different and possibly how they could not be different, what the possibilities and the constraints are. I am finishing very soon, just one minute. Thank you. I don't think everybody needs to study anthropology for its magic to work, but everybody deserves a drop of anthropology in their lives. It can make us better equipped, not only to understand our own lives and those of others, but also to come to grip with the challenges facing humanity and the planet at this moment, about which it can be said that we live in the best of time and the worst of times. So again, thank you so much for this. And I think we still have a job to do in public anthropology and in being part of the long conversation about what it means, not only to be human, but to be part of this long planetary history. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. That was incredibly thought-provoking. I don't know how the COVID was presented to you in Norway, but in the UK, our Prime Minister stood at the lectern and had scientists on either side that were either epidemiologists or public health medicine or statisticians. How different do you think the message, or what would the message be if one of the scientists next to the Prime Minister had been an anthropologist? How would an anthropologist have advised the Prime Minister to present the pandemic information, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, probably in a less hierarchical way. An anthropologist would probably have argued that try to speak as an equal and try to speak about your own vulnerability as well, which your Prime Minister actually would have been in a good position to do eventually. Yes, I mean, try to take other people seriously and begin there, you know, instead of taking this sort of lofty view from above and telling people what to do. Because when you tell people what to do, many of them would be inclined to do exactly the opposite.
I wonder if at times, you know, we were guilty in these presentations of forgetting that it was people that we were talking to and that anthropologists understand people. And when people were going through these difficult situations, trying to adapt and cope with change, I do think our message might have been very different. And maybe in public anthropology, anthropology needs to set a little bit more of a higher profile.
I think so. And the thing is that, you know, there's a lot of talk about the public understanding of science, but there's far less talk about the scientific understanding of the public.
Yes,
and maybe we have a contribution to make there.
I think I shall use that quote many times, but I will attribute it to you, I promise. Thomas, thank you so much, and congratulations on being the recipient of our 2021 Public Anthropology Award. Thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, as we move to our final presentation of the afternoon, which is the President's Lifetime Achievement Award for 2021. This award goes to an academic who has, during their career, demonstrated outstanding and sustained commitment to anthropology. Professor Ruth Tringham read archaeology at Edinburgh University before studying and travelling in Czechoslovakia, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Yugoslavia, which led her to becoming a specialist in Eastern Europe. She spent a postdoctoral year in Leningrad on a British Council grant before a year teaching material culture at University College London under the mentorship of Peter Akko. Having published extensively on European prehistory, she was appointed to a post at Harvard University in 1971 before moving to Berkeley in 1978, where she is currently Emeritus Professor. Ruth continues to serve as the Director of the Centre for Digital Anthropology at Berkeley. Already a specialist in the analysis of stone tools, Tringham began a series of important field projects at early agricultural settlements in Serbia and Bulgaria before leading the Berkeley University research team at Çatalhöyük and Anatolia. At the same time, she became one of the leading figures in the development of feminist archaeology. And then from 1980s onwards, she also developed an interest in the possibilities of digital archaeology, specializing in the life histories of buildings, their occupants, and the multi-sensorial construction of place. Throughout this long career, Professor Tringham has been an inspiration to her students, profoundly they might raise. And this, combined with her fascination for digital media, has resulted in extraordinarily successful teamwork. This may be seen, for instance, in the publication Last House on the Hill, a dynamic and effervescent series into the Neolithic house, and show how the data obtained can be fruitfully transferred to the digital sphere. Questioning, innovative, yet never forgetting the importance of retaining a sense of evidence. A leader in theory and in practice, anthropology was indeed fortunate when Professor Tringham decided to make it her career. And it is with great pleasure now that I invite her to discuss her life and her work. Professor Tringham.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm so honored and thankful for this award. It feels like a homecoming. For that reason, a lot of my response today will focus on how my experiences before leaving for the United States set the foundation for what I became. In the trajectory of my intellectual development and my career, I have responded to the opportunities created by three different kinds of people: the inspirers, who may or may not have known me; the enablers or nurturers, who knowingly provided opportunities along the way; and the mentors, who guided me at the beginning in the 10 minutes allotted to me. I need to acknowledge especially the last two groups. I'm going to share my screen with you now. Okay, I think we're off with that. The only single authored book I have written, Hunters, Fishers and Farmers of Eastern Europe, was dedicated to my three mentors and the memory of V. Gordon Childe, who was in many respects my intellectual ancestor. My three mentors all had a long-term effect on my subsequent career and intellectual growth, for which I am eternally grateful. Stuart Pigott was my supervisor for both undergraduate and PhD degrees at the University of Edinburgh. Stuart had a European-wide view of prehistory and a network of contacts throughout Europe with whom he put me in touch. He was my first mentor. However, on my first day in Edinburgh, he warned, "You'll never get a job with an archaeology degree." Nevertheless, from my first summer as an undergraduate, he supported and enabled my participation in archaeological excavations in Scandinavia and then in Czechoslovakia. Now, in my more humanistic phase, I wish that I had given more attention to Stuart's poetic and highly literate side, but I was impatient and ambitious to explore new domains and spread my wings, and that I did from the moment I met Bohumil or Bobik Sodski, a brilliant polymath maverick archaeologist. I participated in 1962 as an undergraduate in his excavation of Bilani, a Neolithic site of enormous importance for Czechoslovakia and for Central European prehistory. Like Stuart, Sodski had a European-wide view of prehistory, but from a viewpoint in the middle of the continent. He had an encyclopedic knowledge of Neolithic agriculturalists and a love of energetic debate. The British Council enabled me to spend my first graduate year at Prague and Bílany and to gain a most valuable mentor who remained so from 1962 to his untimely death in 1976. Bobby Sodski and I became best mates, made possible by my most powerful tool, the guitar. He guided me in a PhD project that encompassed a large swath of Neolithic Eastern Europe, but it still took me another 20 years in the mid-1980s to really appreciate his early view of what became household archaeology. On Sodski's advice, in my dissertation research travel in Central and Southeast Europe, I presented myself modestly as an apprentice, as someone focusing not on figurines or pottery, but on the unprepossessing flaked stone lithic assemblages. I used the same tactic as a postdoc during another British Council scholarship, this time in the Soviet Union at Leningrad University. By a happy coincidence, your last year's RAI Lifetime Achievement awardee, Caroline Humphrey, and I were in the same cohort of the British Council adventurers. My initial aim there was to expand my doctoral research eastwards to encompass Neolithic European USSR. That idea became a tad derailed when I met Sergei Semyonov. Through my focus on lithics, I had read his prehistoric technology, in which he described his innovative experiments using stone tools and then microscopically examining them for contact traces in order to understand how prehistoric tools were used, rather than guessing their use based on their shape. He called this traceology or traceologia, though it is more commonly known in the US and the UK as microware. I was placed under the supervision of Semyonov's assistant, Galya Korobkova. She and I took our microware equipment, you can see us here in the pics, to a Neolithic excavation at Soroki in Moldavian Soviet Socialist Republic on the banks of the Dniester River, where I learned not only the skills of microware analysis, that would be the foundation of my early research in the United States, but also the skills of excavating Neolithic burned clay house rubble that would be the basis of my excavation projects in Serbia. In 1967, I was actually the first Western participant in a Soviet excavation in a very, very long time, perhaps since the revolution. My third mentor was someone very familiar to the RAI and to everyone here in London, Peter Akko, as Sue has said to you. I became friends with Peter during my participation in the 1968 research seminar on domestication. In 1969, I was hired at UCL to help teach Peter's History of Material Culture courses. I owe him an enormous debt of gratitude for turning me into an anthropologically thinking archaeologist, teaching me how to teach critical awareness, and, after many tears on my part, turning my book manuscript, Hunters, Fishers and Farmers of Eastern Europe, into a worthy volume. The big red letters M for meaning in the margin of my manuscript every time when I wrote the word influence or similarly lazy implicit term became a technique I used in my own teaching and research writing. With all this, Peter prepared me unwittingly or wittingly for employment in an anthropology department in the United States, at Harvard and then at UC Berkeley. Once in the US, I had no more mentors, but in the short time left, I want to acknowledge just a few of the enablers whose support at different times helped to create the researcher that I became. At Harvard and then at Berkeley, the expectation of starting a field project involving excavation led to my 4 projects, Selevats, Opovo, Podgorica, and Çatalhöyük. 3 of these were joyous experiments in which I was able to experiences, I should say, rather than experiments, in which I was able to combine changing theoretical research standpoints with the investigation of early agricultural settlements. Many brilliant students participated in these projects, but one, Mirjana Stevanovic, became my most valued colleague in the field. She can be seen in each of these photographs. Together, we finessed the methodology that we employed at all 4 projects and nurtured the ideas that came out of them. Then 2 events, 10 years apart, both enabled by my dear friend and colleague Meg Conkey, changed my professional life. The first in 1988, when Meg and Joan Giraud organized the Women and Prehistory Conference. Here you can see the 4 women who contributed to my theoretical epiphany. Henrietta Moore asked me, what if you were allowed to envisage the people? Alison Wiley made it scientifically feasible, and Joan Giraud and Meg Conkey celebrated the ambiguity of archaeological materials, and my whole future practice of archaeology opened up into a prehistory with life. The following year, Meg became my colleague at UC Berkeley. You will know her from her 2018 RAI Huxley lecture. Meg quickly nurtured our department at Berkeley to become famous for its vibrant group of feminist archaeologists. Meg Conkey loves the way, as she puts it, that she and I each push each other out onto the ice to see if it will break with our new ideas. I followed her lead onto the fragile ice of the feminist practice of archaeology and found it to be not only strong, but electrifying enough to try out non-linear narratives created with an informed imagination. 10 years later, in 1998, Meg enabled the creation of the MacTIA, the Multimedia Authoring Center for Teaching in Anthropology, a multi-generational collaboratory of students and faculty in which we transformed ourselves into digital publishers of nonlinear thought. I was already an early adopter of digital technology and, urged on by my colleague Rosemary Joyce, used hypermedia narratives to link stories with data from my excavations. Many students accompanied me on that adventure, but 2 of them who became my friends and founded their own careers on it need to be acknowledged. Michael Ashley and Colleen Morgan. They guided me and pushed me to my technological limits. Michael shared with me and Meg in the establishment of the non-profit company Center for Digital Archaeology that emerged out of the MacTIA as Meg and I retired, and I thank them all profoundly. Hang on. And so I also give thanks to you, the Royal Anthropological Institute, to Sue Black for her elegant and kind words, and the committee who have graciously given me this award and the opportunity to think about my life and so much more. Thank you.
Ruth, that was just inspirational. Thank you so very much indeed. You've seen a lot of change over that lifetime in the profession. What do you think has been the biggest change that has made such a difference in feminist archaeology? If you could pinpoint it down to what was that moment where you knew something was no longer the same?
Oh my goodness. So what was different? What was the difference that feminist archaeology made, or what was the change in feminist archaeology? What was
the change that really allowed feminist archaeology to blossom?
It had been kind of growing for some time. Of course, the year of my epiphany with that conference was not the earliest time that it had been, that the whole idea of feminist archaeology had been suggested. It was already growing in the 80s with Meg Conkey and Janet Spector's article. But I think what happened then in the 1960s was something that there was a conjunction with what the feminists were saying about, for example, the ambiguity of archaeology, the need for self-reflexivity and so on, that had also been proposed by the post-processual archaeology literature and conferences. So it was all something that was happening at the same time, this idea of questioning yourself in order to do archaeology which meant more to other people, which wasn't just about trying to prove whether women were there, which was not part of the feminist archaeology program, or what happened in prehistory. It was an idea to talk about the archaeologists themselves as needing to think of themselves as people as well as scientists who all had different ideas, and that coming out to coming eventually to the truth of history, what happened in prehistory, was no longer the main aim of archaeology. It was to understand all of the different ways, the different scenarios, and the different explanations that that were possible about the past, and that what was more important was to respect other people's opinions, but also to think about and in detail follow through one's own opinion, one's own scenarios of the past, and really think, how do I know this? Why do I know this? What is actually inspiring my imagination to come up with these ideas of the past? What can make a more plausible, what makes one explanation more plausible than another? I mean, that's for me, that was the big change. But what's going on in the background of all of this, you have to remember, is the Berlin Wall is coming down. I could no longer work in Serbia because of the Serbian civil war. This is all happening at the same time. And then the World Wide Web was starting. So with all of those things happening around 89 to 92, 93 was an enormously exciting time.
Hugely influential. Oh, Ruth, I could talk to you all afternoon, and I'm afraid that we can't, because we have run out of time. So I just want to say congratulations as president, but also on behalf of all the fellows of the RAI. And that it has been such a pleasure to meet with you this afternoon and to award you with the Lifetime Achievement Award.
Thank you so much, Sue. My heart goes out to all of you.
You're very kind. Thank you so much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I am sure you will agree that we have had a tremendous afternoon. My huge thanks to Fiona Jordan, to Larry Zimmerman, to John Lord, to Thomas Hylland, Eriksen, and later there, of course, to Ruth Tringham. I think it's a clear indication that the world from its broadest sense of anthropology and archaeology is in very, very good hands. And we've had some really, really inspirational talks this afternoon. Just to say thank you to everybody for this afternoon, for attending, those who have accepted the awards, and also, of course, to Haneen and to Amanda behind the scenes, who make sure that everything runs so smoothly. Gosh, have we learned a lot over the last 18 months on how to do this, haven't we, Amanda? Absolutely. But please, this evening at 5:30, can I just remind you that it is the 2021 Curl Lecture. It will be given by Dr. Rachel Crellin from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient History at Leicester University, and her lecture is entitled Post-Humanist Feminist Archaeology, A Becoming. I hope you will join us, and as Amanda has said, please remember that it is a separate link to this one, so we all need to come off this link now. And thank you to everybody for joining us this afternoon. As always, it's an inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. Bye.